Welcome to the 2022 Wilderness Speaker Series. This is the first part of the three series that we're going to be doing this year. The organizations that are behind this is the Northwest Montana Lookout Association, which is the group that is sponsoring Doug Chadwick tonight, and also the Wild Montana and the Bob Marshall Wilderness Association. And we couldn't have this happen if it wasn't possible through the Flathead Valley Community College, which really is a great facility to make something like this happen. Basically, the Lookout Association is really a pleasure to have Doug as our speaker. He is a wildlife biologist who carried out research on mountain goat ecology and social behavior in the Rockies for many years, and has assisted other scientists studying the harlequin ducks, wolverines, grizzly bears, and whales. Doug also is a natural history journalist and has produced over 15 popular books and hundreds of magazine articles. Many of his articles have been for the National Geographic Society on topics from leopards in the high Himalayas to the lowland forests and to the underwater kingdoms of the coral reefs around the world. He is a founding board member of the Vital Ground Foundation, a conservation land trust. Doug also serves on the board of the Liz Claiborne Art Ortenberg Foundation, which supports wildlife research and community-based conservation programs throughout the world. So without more about Doug, I'm sure I could go on forever. I introduce you to Doug Chadwick.
Okay, first of all, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I don't need to turn this up. I don't know how to turn it up. Okay for now? Because I'm going to wander around while I talk. And this has been up for a while. And the first thing I need to say is that this book that I have out is a way of just talking about nature and how it really works, how we think of it, and what we really are and how we think of ourselves. It's a pretty big subject, but it's not really 4/5 about grizzly bears. And to drive home that point, I'm going to start by showing you my baby picture, because it is 4/5 about me. There it is. Can you guys see this okay? Should we dim the lights a little bit or not? What do you think, Kel? Oh, it looks complicated. Okay, that'll work. Yeah, thank you. So there are two things I want to start off saying. One is that about 99.999% of all the creatures that inhabit the only living planet we know are invisible to us. They're microbes. And the other thing is there is no creature on the planet above, I hate to say above and below, but larger than bacteria and the similar looking archaea, these little single cell guys, that is an individual. All of them are compound creatures, as are we all. So I started off at 4/1000ths of an inch in diameter. I was a microbe. You were a microbe. This guy right here was a microbe for sure. But you've done good. I've done good. adult human with 30 trillion human cells. And what?
Adult for each cell in our natural, yeah.
Okay. And
Sorry.
no. But I had another at least 30 trillion cells in my body, in my guts, in my mouth, on my skin, in the unmentionable damp places, all kinds of things. And whereas I have 23,000 genes, the microbes in my body, which are bacteria, archaea, single-celled fungi, and protozoans, have 40 million genes. So if you grind me up and analyze my genes as a little bit of human and a whole bunch of partners. These guys are doing my digesting for me. They're boosting my immune system. They're keeping out harmful pathogens. The balance of them is affecting my health in general. And I think a lot of people know that. We're more aware of it these days with probiotics and stuff. But what's really coming on in science is the hormones and the neurotransmitters that a lot of these microbes produce. And they interact with our brain. And they're starting to look at our guts in particular as the biggest gland in the body. And it is producing stuff like dopamine and serotonin, which are mood changers. And so they are influencing our happiness, our calmness, our anxiety, depression, depending on how the balance is. So that's us. And in each of my 30 trillion human cells, they are loaded up with the energies, the little battery organelles that provide the power for everything we do and think and feel. Mitochondria. So this is Bio 101. I apologize a little for that, but what I want to get at is that mitochondria, they only recently discovered, really, are highly modified bacteria, ancient bacteria. So you can add that to the totals. And this is my reminder to say, I relate to the world in an I, me, mine frame of mind, but in reality, I function as an us. And so do all people. And so do all organisms except bacteria in our camp. So they're a symbiotic relationship, which is partners, combo critters, joint ventures. And the obvious ones I think people know about are coral reefs, which built much of the world. And they consist of a polyp-like animal in combination with algae that photosynthesize and produce food for the coral. And that's one reason the coral reefs around the world are disappearing at a great rate, is the algae can't tolerate high temperatures and they flee the coral. And without their algae, over time they die. Lichens. Fungus and algae. That's what I learned in school. And then a guy at the University of Montana found out there's always at least two kinds of fungus in different families. And in addition to algae, there are photosynthesizing bacteria. Who knew? And so what you have is not just symbiosis, but a group of symbionts, a community of them, and that's a holobiont. So that's what I am. That's what you guys are. No matter how you think of yourselves, what your political persuasion, whatever your philosophies and beliefs, you are a multiple creature. And when I think of a tree, any bush, any wildflower, almost any, there are exceptions, what I see is the equivalent of a lichen, because more than 92 or 93% of all the plants investigated have hundreds or thousands of miles of invisible fungal threads, symbiotic fungi attached to their roots. They increase the roots reach by an order of 10, and those fungal networks called mycorrhizae extend to other organisms. So you have mother trees through their roots, through this underground internet, in contact with the seedlings of their offspring. You have trees connected to other trees, or maybe to bushes that produce nitrogen in their roots. And they need to borrow a little of that because they live in a place that doesn't have enough for growth. And so they're also sending messages in the form of plant hormones about, I'm ready to flower, you guys want to synchronize, or I'm under attack by insects, you better boost up your anti-bug compounds. And so what's a tree? I mean, again, when I started looking into natural history, there were plants and there were animals. But I could spend the night up here talking about animals, like even single-celled ones that they look like a paramecium, a little protozoan, squiggling around in your guts, and but it's also in the earth, in pond sky, anywhere you look. And it has an eye spot, it has a flagellum, it can scoot around, it can twist and turn, it can devour other single cells, but it also has the ability to photosynthesize. But anyway, what's a tree? How far does it go? What's the organism to focus on? Where's the individual? And let's go back to the green part of the tree, the one we all know and what we call a plant. And of course, every cell is being energized to do whatever cells do, grow and reproduce, by mitochondria, they're bacteria. And then the chloroplasts, which do the work of photosynthesis, are highly modified cyanobacteria that first evolved about 2.2 billion years ago and have been filling the atmosphere, which used to be methane and carbon dioxide and sulfur compounds, with oxygen. And none of you lookout people here tonight, I've talked to a lot of them already, could breathe up there if it weren't for cyanobacteria. So let's have a moment of, we don't have to applaud, but I mean, they do the work. And so again, just trying to think of nature differently. And why am I going through all the geek stuff, Bio 101? Well, if you can put up with it just a little bit more. But we're going to look at one more tree, and that's the whistling thorn acacia in East Africa. And it has all those other partners that we just went through. In addition, it produces big spines to keep things like elephants and giraffes from grazing on it. But it also inflates some of the spines so they can serve as nests for ants. These particular ants are tied to the whistling thorn acacia. And the acacia produces these kind of golden tips on the leaves. Those are sugary little bodies called nectaries that feed the ants. And in return for food and lodging, these ants are wandering all over the leaves and stems, and in specialized grooves on their feet are specialized symbiotic bacteria that produce compounds toxic to the little grazers, which are other insects, moles, and bacteria. And in its roots, it has nodules that contain nitrogen-fixing bacteria that produce nutrients in what can otherwise be a pretty impoverished kind of environment. So, when I go to Africa, and I spend a lot of time there, I'm like everybody else on safari, or whatever I'm doing, and I'm mesmerized by the bounty and diversity, the pageant of big animal life, fellow mammals. This is the Serengeti in the rainy season. It looks pretty lush. But East Africa, as you probably know, is subject to serious droughts, year-long droughts. Those grasses are dry and brown much of the year in between rainy rainy spells. So what keeps it so fertile that it can support that great wildlife we all go to see? And the answer is the animals that outnumber and outweigh all the big mammals in East Africa, and in fact in a lot of the tropics, and that's termites. And we know they digest plant matter of all kinds, animal droppings, they're recycling it, they're nourishing that savanna, they're nourishing the subtropics. They also eat wood, they can even eat wood. But of course they don't. It's protozoans in their guts that do. That's what I learned in school. And then 2 years ago, somebody said, nah, it's the bacteria living on the cell walls of the protozoans that produce the digestive enzymes. So symbionts within symbionts within symbionts. And again, why am I talking about all this? Is because the way we think about nature is going to determine how much remains in pretty short order. 350,000 years ago, or 300, something like that, 300,000, Homo sapiens arose, us folks. And it wasn't until, you see that gap in there, it wasn't until just 12,000 years ago that the total number of humans on the planet reached its first million. Okay, and then it didn't increase very fast from there until about 1800. We hit our first billion. When I went to school, learned about how to conserve things, how do we save nature, so to speak. There are about this many, 2.5, 2.3 billion people in the world. We're at 8 now. And a graph for the number of species that are rare, threatened, endangered, or extinct looks about the same. So that's why I'm talking about how we think about nature and ourselves. We still are dividing it into categories that nature doesn't work that way, and we still see ourselves as largely separate and semi-independent, at least, of nature, and entitled to do what we want. Because I don't know why. That's how we are. It worked. You don't get 8 billion people if it didn't. But here's where we stand when we talk about conservation. Oh, okay. The pie chart, sorry, I'm learning my buttons. You can ignore this one. This is 1900, 2000. This is the living weight of all the mammals on planet Earth. The blue is us, humans. The gray, or whatever color that is, the big part of the pie, that's our livestock. The green, this is 2000, this much narrower slice right now, that's all the wild mammals that still exist on Earth. So, you know, if you hear someone talking about compromise, which usually means how do we get just a little bit more and a little bit less for the native things that live there, just keep that in mind. And also keep in mind, this over here represents the fact that in the last 50 years, the total number of vertebrates, and that's fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals, around the globe, based on thousands of censuses, in the last half century, they have declined 70% total number. So this is not an environmental issue here and there, or a particularly bad few years. This is your living planet having a stroke. And we've almost lost the greatest creatures ever roam the earth, the great whales. And where there were 25 to 50 million elephants in Africa a couple centuries ago, there are a few 100,000 here and there. And all of them are under under extreme pressure. But my question is, what all are we losing besides their role, outsized role in ecosystems? One of the things to think about is the knowledge they transmit to future generations of their own kind. They have elaborate social systems, terrific communication systems, and both elephants and great whales can communicate subsonically in addition to all the sounds we hear. Squeaks and trumpets and growls and songs and so on, in the case of whales. You can't hear their subsonic communications, but there are a lot of them. And you feel it in your bones when you're in the water with whales, or when you're within 5 feet of an elephant. You see its forehead fluttering, and it's producing a message to other elephants that can travel through dense forests or over large distances in the savannas. But anyway, this is a sperm whale brain, and this is the human brain we're so proud of. Just saying. And here again is, you can all read, the human, the pilot whale, and there's the elephant with the brain 3 times the size of ours. So when I ask what else we're losing as we kind of tear through the fauna of the planet at this rate, elephants have, cancer cells can happen anytime in a body with a lot of cells. And we say we've got trillions. Imagine how many an elephant has, and yet cancer is almost unheard of in elephants. So what can we learn from them? So, okay, I've done the geek part of the talk, and the eco-bummer part of the talk, where you tell people, oh, here's another really horrible, terrible thing you might not know. So let me explain it. And, well, how come I never get invited back, to parties and stuff? Here's what works. That's what this section is. And we happen to be right in the middle of it. And you can see the historical distribution. The hot colors represent the greatest diversity of the big carnivores and the big grazers in North America. Big, majestic, inspiring animals that draw us out into the woods around here and into the mountains. So it has shrunk, but what remains is quite a lot. One of the few intact ecoregions in the world, where every native species that belongs here is really still here. And that is a 2,000-mile swath from the Yukon down to south of Yellowstone, the Wind River. And the black outlines the Yellowstone to Yukon Conservation Initiative, which targets this area for conservation. So in 1993, look, we all have the legacy of marvelous parks created by foresighted people in earlier generations, up and down the Rockies. From Muskwa-Kachika area, Nahanni River up north, through Jasper and Banff, down to Glacier, Bob Marshall, Yellowstone, and central Idaho. Wilderness and parks. These are the strongholds of wildlife. That's what keeps the whole place going. And this could be a map of the national parks and other preserves in East Africa. This could be a map of Thailand's preserves. But what I also see when I look at it is an archipelago. I see a series or a string of islands. And most extinctions that have been documented since 1500 have taken place on islands, the great majority of them. For obvious reasons, they're isolated. They can't leave when the hurricane comes or is an epidemic or volcano goes off or whatever it is. And they get inbred because they have to breed breed within that one area. They can't get refreshed by genetic exchange. So what do? You need to connect. And that's what's been going on in our ecoregion, Yellowstone to Yukon. It was about 5% connected in 1993, and now, what is that, 21 years later? It's more than 30% connected. And that isn't through a super park or a lot of regulatory stuff. It's by a combination of different management of the lands in between, tribal management in some areas, private lands, working with land trusts to conserve their acreage, continue to use it as they wish, except with the rider that you need to keep it permeable to wildlife, so they can move, so they can adapt to changing climates and other conditions, and they can exchange genes. And if an area gets a low population, it can be recolonized by the next nearest ones. That's what will hold up over time. So when we say we saved nature, this was a start. This is the old model of conservation, and it's worldwide. But around the world too, I've seen these efforts to try to string these together so they're connected. And then we can pat ourselves in the back and say, we've really saved nature. This will hold up over time. An example too of the NCDE up here. This would be the Glacier Bob Marshall grizzly bear recovery area. There's Lincoln, there's Missoula. This is a bear coming out of probably the Garnets. And I don't know what the bear wanted to do, but it looks like it's trying to get south to Yellowstone. And it was a young male. You would be bringing a fresh set of genes down to the now isolated, still isolated Yellowstone population. But here's a close-up of what he did. He came down and he hit I-90. And he bounced off that how many times? Over 2 years. Would not cross. And finally, found a spot, and he went down into the Pintlers, and that was the last I'd seen of him. But it worked. And this is to say, connectivity needs to happen on a big scale between connected strongholds, but there's also needs to happen on this scale. This is a footbridge for four-legged pedestrians up in Banff. I bet a lot of you have seen it. And you've seen the one on 93 as you're approaching Missoula. It doesn't take much, but all the animals use it. They've documented it with cameras, with radio tracking, and it's terrifically important because there are some animals, and especially female grizzlies with cubs, that will not cross a busy highway. And so the populations can be turned into subpopulations and become isolated just by a highway, and often that's where we put our developments and railroads and other things that create a real barrier. This picture is also to say that I don't need to say that they're a lot like us. And you've seen that I like brains. Brains. It's like a zombie. This is our great human brain that we think makes us so special. Here's one of our nearest relative, the chimpanzee, and here's a bear. So they live like we do a long time, up to 35 years or more. They're learning all the while. If you hang some food where a bear can't reach it, they do this in compounds where they've got captive grizzlies. The grizzlies will go around and get stumps and rocks and build themselves a pile they can get up on top of and get food. Elephants do the same thing with slightly larger scale. But they can count, they can solve problems, and not to say they're our great big bear buddies, but they cover that spectrum from, the scary stories, the scary bears, to nearly like us, or much more so than most people would ever imagine. I don't know what happened there with this slide, but anyway, I'm going to go right by that. That was supposed to be the umbrella species, like if it's good enough for bears to live in, because they have huge home ranges, they use every habitat from the bottomlands to the mountaintops. They're omnivores like we are. And they have these great memories of where the food is at a given time of year. And if you are conserving grizzly bears, you are encompassing a huge part of the whole wildlife community because of all those habitats that they use. So we're talking trout and trumpeter swans, as well as lynx and wolverines and elk and deer. The other thing you have to do, again, is connect them. So this is a map from Vital Ground, which I'm not ashamed to be pitching for. But we got together 60 bear experts and had them draw on their radio tracking data and sightings and reports, and said, where are the pathways that will connect the bears of Glacier, Bob Marshall, to Yellowstone, and vice versa, to central Idaho, which had a lot of bears and then had zero for decades and now has Risque Candle 2, something like that. Anyway, it has some. They're trying to make their way in there. More have made it into there and been killed. But anyway, give them a route and secure it, make it land at least they can travel through. And again, through a combination of public lands, deals with landowners, different kinds of management, and you can tie together the 5 different bear populations we have around here. And that would include the Selkirks of Idaho, the Cabinet Yaak, western Montana, and Idaho, Glacier, Yellowstone. If they are connected, just like when we're talking about national parks, they can recover. They can be a meta-population. They can be, in effect, one big population without having to make a giant reserve. And it just takes acres in the right place and some willing people, but it's happening. And instead of trying to recover the bears, I won't get into politics, but instead of trying to recover subpopulation by subpopulation, you connect all the existing subpopulations, and then you have recovered the species south of Canada, still listed as threatened. And we say all the other animals need the same thing to a large extent. I think that means I'm supposed to read something. Well, this is easy. Do unto ecosystem. Well, this is this talk, this book, is what I was referring to, is meant to blend fresh information and ideas together with the kind of hope we need to keep us company on a new path guided by an adapted golden rule. Do unto ecosystems as you would have them do unto you. Nurture, sustain health, allow it to flourish. That wasn't so long. But I know you've been seeing this book, and but I just put this up to say it's a little odd to be claiming to be 4/5 a grizzly, right? It's like, I'm just that tough. And just that wild guy. And the truth is, bears are very smart, but I know something they don't know, and that's that I share at least 80% of my genes with the grizzly bear. They're identical. So I really am at least 4/5 a grizzly in that sense. I'm a lot of bears, 4/5 a bear. And it's because I share at least 80% of my genes with virtually every other one of the 5,400 some mammal species on the planet. So, you guys do too. So, you can pick any critter you like and identify with it, and you won't be wrong. And I'm not even talking about the behavioral traits we share, the nerves and glands and emotions, the feelings of joy or stress or whatever it is. Just, you're built of the same stuff. And I like snow leopards. In fact, where'd it go? Oh, never mind. Well, then there's bats. More than 1 out of every 5 species of mammals on the planet is a bat. So unless you are actually the Batman or the Batwoman, you might find them kind of less than, charming to identify with. But all of you are also at least 4/5 of a hopelessly adorable red panda. You share 98 to 99% of your genes with chimpanzees, our nearest relative. I think that's pretty well known how closely we're related. We're cousins. What isn't as well known is that you share 50 to 60% of your genes with fish. And 30 to 40% with some insects, like these lightning bugs or luminescent beetles. Well, I'm going to go right by the dung beetle part because I want people to have a good time. But I did a story on beetles for National Geographic, and we called it Planet of the Beetles. And it's because of the 1.2 million species identified and labeled so far on Earth. There may be many millions more, but of that 1.2 million, 400,000 plus are beetles. There's more different kinds of beetles than there is different kinds of anything else. And if you want to see nature the most creative, go looking for critters like the samurai beetle, is what we call this one, or like to call this one. Now I put this one up just because I love that picture. I don't know what percent of my genes are identical with sea angels, or your genes are identical. They're actually a sea slug, but I'm guessing about between 20 and 30%, seeing as how we share 24% of our genes with a wine grape. And I talked to some of you people here. I'm not going to name any names or point any fingers, but I've been to their house to parties, and they're definitely a little bit more than 24% wine sometimes. And 18% of baker's yeast, and you share 7% of your genes with the most abundant organisms on the planet, which outnumber the stars in the universe known, bacteria. Gotta read. However broadly or narrowly one defines identical genes, I am in a sense alive in a a mind-boggling number of creatures in a staggering range of environments around the globe through the DNA we share. I leap, I fly, I slither, I shimmer with iridescent scales in the waters off Zanzibar, and I stretch my petals towards the light in far northern Siberia. Being more closely related to avocados, ants, and aardvarks than most people suspect doesn't dilute our stature as humans, but instead increases it manyfold. It renders us more than human. This is our deep heritage, an old enduring kinship as big as the living world. And I hope that was uplifting, because now we're going to talk about viruses for a minute. This is how we've been viewing them for the last couple of years. Well, that was a particularly big one, you guys never. Anyway, this is not the time to maybe celebrate viruses, except I do need to tell you that if I stand in a 1 square yard of ground, or at sea could somehow do that, in 24 hours I would have 800 million viruses rain onto me. We live in a broth of them. Bacteria and viruses are so abundant. We don't see them, we don't sense them, we don't think of the world of life like that, what makes it a living planet. But it helps to know that a lot of the precipitation we get, the water has to form around a particle. And it turns out that viruses and bacteria swept off the Earth's surface up into the stratosphere are a major source of rainfall. And it's just a big interaction like that. But the other thing I want to tell you is that, whether you like it or not, 8% of the human genome is now thought to be of viral origin. It's DNA brought to us by a virus that infected us or an ancestor, maybe a very distant ancestor, and stayed in our chromosomes. Now, that includes some genes that got repurposed from a viral origin and are key to the implantation of a fertilized egg in the human uterus and forming the placenta. So we're all here because of viral genes. Some of us have been disappearing lately because of viruses, but that's pretty universal. And also now they're starting to think that some of the formation of long-term memories, or what the strength of those memories in the human brain, is mediated by a viral gene. So I'm not trying to tell you these are proven facts. The research is being done. I'm trying to say that we have an awful lot left to learn. We're starting to learn much more in an era of molecular biology and high-powered instruments that let us analyze nature at a whole different level and see it as see creatures as holobionts, see the genes and their impact on creatures. But I'll turn towards the end here to one of those organisms that we probably share, I don't know what percent of our genes with, but maybe 20%, maybe more. But that's not the point. The point is that I read today, by the way, my wife Karen is here. She's a lookout in the park. And so give it up for the lookouts first. Anyway, she sent me a news item this morning, and it's that the government of Canada is giving out free passes to the Canadian national parks to doctors, so doctors can prescribe time in national parks for their patients. And a lot of doctors on both sides of the border are starting to prescribe time outdoors, contact with nature, for their patients, especially people suffering anxiety and stress and depression. If you live in Japan or South Korea, and you go on what's called guided forest bathing sessions, which just means, probably a lot of you know, but immersing all your senses in a natural environment, preferably an old green space, quiet. It's healthy enough. The outcomes for everything from chronic stress and anxiety, which leads to diabetes and heart problems and all these other things. The effect is positive enough that the insurance companies there will pay you to go forest bathing. So that's a pretty strong measure of its effectiveness. What happens is you go out into a green space or a natural space, and it can be a wild bunch of backcountry around here that we're all lucky to have, or it can be a little park bench in an urban park. It can be tending a garden. And if you have someone beside you with a whole bag full of instruments, they can measure that your heart rate slows, your blood pressure drops, your immune system gets boosted. They can measure the metabolism of the natural killer cells and other defenders of your body, and your cognitive process becomes sharper. And what more do you want? And other studies show how much contact with nature leads to better health and a sense of well-being, but how much also is associated with longevity, greater longevity. So while we're out here arguing over environmental issues, save this, save that, just this endless polarized look at how we treat nature. I keep thinking maybe we're missing something, and that's, is there somebody out there, some politician out there that wouldn't want to offer better health and well-being and a longer life, and that make more green, keep more green. And it doesn't have to be, again, a big plot of land, but how about a little more neighborhood green spaces for kids to play in? And it doesn't mean as much, I think, to an audience like this, because we're blessed with plenty of places to get out in the way. But 87% of the time Americans spend is spent indoors. These are from studies by the National Institute of Health. And another 6% is spent in an enclosed form of transportation, trains, planes, and automobiles. That's 93% on average of Americans' lives is spent in shells of their own making. And we also, if you were to track yourself during the day, I bet you'd be surprised by what's the ratio of being outdoors in contact with nature to being inside. But anyway, most of the world is becoming urban. In 1800, there were about 3% of the human population was urban. It's now about 60%. And in developed countries, it's usually closer to 70, 75. So let's just think about the environments we're creating for ourselves and how we define progress. I know this is getting really general, but I mean, it's super important because the data are there of what is most beneficial to your health and longevity and sense of well-being and mental balance. And I won't take time to go into it. The truth is nobody knows exactly why this stuff works, and it works automatically. You can be out there, you can hate greenies and eat nothing but junk food and, I don't know, you push old ladies under taxi cabs. And if you go out into a green space, those same things are gonna happen to your heart rate, and blood pressure, and cognitive abilities. It's just automatic. Why? Probably because between our ancient hominid ancestors and more recent ones, there was no such thing as going out into the wild, into a green space, because it was all wild until just a very brief time ago. That's what we evolved in, that's what shaped our bodies and minds. Oh, maybe I'll say it better in here. And thanks for your patience with this. Oh, maybe I'll get to the right page, it's gonna work. Here we go. A little contact with natural environments is healthy. More is healthier. Being involved with nature is not a particular choice. It is not a hobby, as bird watching or flower gardening are often described. It is not any sort of special interest, the practice of a philosophy, or a concern best suited to extra-sensitive types, or to folks keen to preserve antique objects and historical sites, or even to hardcore outdoor enthusiasts. That's because having a relationship with nature is not optional. You've been immersed in nature since the chromosomes of your father's sperm joined those of your mother's egg. No matter what kind of activities or groups you identify with now, you stay profoundly involved with nature day and night because it built and selected the genes that in turn built you and the operating systems of your body and mind. Those systems respond to nature's presence, and they respond in more subtle but very real ways to its absence, to its replacement by modern settings and stimuli. There are no exceptions. And this is a serious part. We've got graphs now. Let's just skip right by this. Let's just say, in the past, we on the left-hand side here, we kind of look at sustainable development. That means saving stuff. And we see it as kind of a place of compromise between the economy, the environment, other social needs. And over here is what I think is the fact that as the health of our economy goes, it depends on the health of the society, which in turn depends on the health of the environment over time. It's not either or. It's not a kind of a compromise. It's one and the same thing. And Montana, the flathead, is kind of proof right here in front of us that it's not the ecology versus economy. It's not jobs versus the environment. Tourism and recreation have since surpassed agriculture, logging, mining, all the other sources of revenue for the state. And I know we could get into a long talk about how good is all this with the changes we're seeing today, but still, let's get past the old way of looking at things. And let's get past looking at us as somehow separate from nature or somehow different qualitatively, a whole different kind of critter. And I think, again, if we're going to save nature, we have to understand a whole lot more about how it works and what we're made of, and see where things converge, and quit looking for divisions and separations. And I just put this graph. I should never end a talk with graphs. I just want to point out that we've set goals for how much carbon is going to be in the atmosphere. Looking towards the future, for human health, for food supplies. They're all optimistic goals, or at least strive towards. Do we have one for ending the endless loss that we've been seeing of species and ecosystems and the degradation of it? Look, we're in a time, and I don't like environmental alarmism, personally. Sky is falling stuff, doom and gloom, but we're changing the composition of the atmosphere and of the seas and the temperature of them. And I pointed out those graphs we're losing. You can't keep losing 70% of the vertebrates on the planet every 50 years before you're left with a badly impoverished ecosystem, and our health is at risk, our life support system is at risk. So why don't we have a nature positivity goal? Because we can do that if we think a little bit differently. And I'm going to read one last thing and then quit sermonizing. So let's say you meet somebody who tells you, look, I hear what you're saying, and it's just, I got my life to live, and I'm just not all that into nature. So you could tell him the truth straight up if you replied, well, nature is not really what you think it is. You're not really what you think you are, and you're only around because nature is totally into you. And get ready, because it might get kind of quiet after that. And I know you can all read, but I don't know in the back. Being one with nature sounds like an aspiration. It really isn't, because we already are. And I think if we can get that through our heads, the future is going to be a lot more lively and full of fellow creatures. So that's it. Thank you. Good, okay.
We recently, with the way things are with hunting in the state, recently.
There you go.
Okay. Helena recently expressed a desire to start hunting wolves. So my question is, how does hunting the wolves factor in this immediate area? Because they haven't been back for all that long. But what is the implication of them being wiped out again? Because it's not like we have thousands and thousands of wolves like we do with deer and the other large animals. So what's your outtake on that?
I'm very close right now, where I'm standing, to a lady who's studied wolves and been the carnivore biologist in this area for a long time, Diane Boyd, and I really hope you'll have a chance to, I didn't ask you whether you were, but I hope you'll be able to talk to her about it, because I don't think I'm going to avoid that one. But what I will say is that since anyway, what I will say is, because I've been talking about communities and wholeness, is that the thing that always puzzles me is that the reason elk are strong and fleet and majestic and social and communicative, have the family structures, the reason moose are so strong, they can bolt those through the snow, the reason goats are up on the cliffs, and mountain sheep are down on the tailless slopes below them, the antelope. Anyway, name a critter of the big animal community around us, and think of how much of that was shaped by the major predator over thousands and thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years. That would be wolves. A lot of other predators too, and Diane can maybe change, she'll tell you more. But I mean, we just keep picking out the wolf and then making it a symbol of a lot of things. And I don't think that's making progress. I don't think we see the wolf yet for the force it is. It's a living, dynamic force. I see the wolf in the elk. I see the elk in the wolf. I don't mean like, oh yeah, I'm the guru, you know, but it's true. And predators and prey, I mean, we've got guys out killing so-called surplus elk all over Montana because they're getting into haystacks and causing crop damage. And yet there's this, I don't know, belief that we've got to do something to stop this horrible decimation of our game populations. Well, elk and deer are at highs. So I don't get it. And the amount of livestock losses, I know it can be very serious to an individual family. And, you know, there are going to have to be some tough decisions made. But overall, the amount of livestock losses is a fraction of 1%. And far more from lightning and, you know, feral dogs and all kinds of things. So I just don't get what the whole, how head up people get or why. So, but Diane is very wise. She will explain it all. So, is there an easy question out there? No easy questions.
Question way in the back. Yell real loud.
What got you into this kind of field of work?
I'm coming over so I can hear the whole thing.
What got you into this kind of field of work? And
What got me into it?
And why have you continued it for so long?
Why have I?
Like stayed into the same field?
Well, because otherwise I would have had to go get an honest job. And look, when I was a kid, my dad gave me a microscope. Maybe you could tell that from the way I started off tonight. But I looked at a drop of pond water and the whole world came alive in a new way. And after that, I was also just hiking and wandering through the countryside all the time, and I wanted to, I can't explain it, but I knew I was going to be a biologist early on. I didn't care what the label was so much as I want to be out there. And I've always, look, the great thing about science is there's no end to it, because there's no end to nature. And that's really the theme is maybe a lot of what I've said, you know, it'll prove to be wrong, because that's how science works. But a lot of what we think we know, in my opinion, about nature and about conservation is not necessarily wrong, but woefully incomplete. And I don't think we can save nature until we understand it better. And that's what I'm trying to get at. I mean, we're working really hard to do nature conservation against a lot of odds, but we're still doing it old school. Crisis, like running from crisis to crisis, like ambulance chasing, instead of taking care of big connected ecosystems. And thinking about ourselves still as, well, you know, we're kind of entitled to do as much as we want, as long as we want, wherever we want. And if there's a little left over, we got enough time and money, we'll do some conservation. And that's not good for the human future as well as for the animals, in my opinion. But that's not a very good explanation, but anyway.
Do you
Any more
see?
questions?
Do you see that, like, that view becoming more popular? I mean, I feel like here in Montana, you said it, we've got this abundance of these playgrounds. People, I think, here are generally aware that we benefit from this. But outside of here, do you think that that's like a view that is taking hold and spreading more in urban areas? Or?
Yeah, I do.
What was the question?
Oh, the question was, we see tourism and recreation becoming stronger and people moving here for the quality of life. There's kind of a trend, just as people are more aware of what they're eating and their microbiome and a lot of things. But I see it, I see it in Europe, I see it in places like India. There's a tremendous demand for wildlife tourism. And Thailand, parts of Africa. The thing is, I showed a picture of the Serengeti. I think with all the wildlife specials on TV, you think, wow, there's still a lot of wild nature in Africa, but most Africans have to go to parks to find it. But there are community conservancies where the government gives communities, local communities, the right to manage wildlife and benefit from tourism. And there's actually more wildlife in those areas, in Kenya, for example, than there are in the national parks. And it's easier to poach in the national parks.
Is that cumulatively, like, between all those different spots?
Well, there are a lot of pretty big connected ones, but there are a lot in different places too. But it's changing. And there are cross-boundary international efforts, say in Congo, Cameroon, Central African Republic, to put the parks of 3 countries together. And I shouldn't use that as an example because it's really hard to get tourists in there.
Yeah.
But other places in Asia are working on that. Tourism's developing in Laos, where they've had almost none. And no one wants to put all their eggs in the tourism basket because we get a really bad global economy than that, where the people have left. But if in other places they're preserving their water source and their sustainable wood or soil or whatever they're doing by becoming more conservation minded, then tourism or no tourism, it should hold up. So I can't give a yes or no answer, but it's place by place I see more all the time. Yeah.
Do you think it's possible to profit from nature and still take care of it and preserve it? And keep in mind, I'm a sawmill owner and a logger.
Yeah.
When you answer,
So is it possible to
profit from nature and still preserve it and take care of it?
Yeah. Is it possible to profit from nature and still preserve it and take care of it? God, I don't know. Yeah, why wouldn't it be? If it's, and you'd know, there's a lot of ways to do logging.
Well, if you look at most species in nature, I don't think they profit. They just take what they need and they give back as much as they take for the trees, the deer, everything. And that's what keeps it balanced. So I question how much we can profit from it and still not abuse it in some way.
Yeah. Can most of you people hear that? No. I gotta get you a microphone. Because that's a really good question.
Excuse me, can you turn yours off and we'll turn this one on? You just cut them off.
I can turn it on.
My question was, if it was
possible to profit from nature? Because if we use nature as our guide, all other species and animals in nature pretty much take what they need and they give back as much as they take. So as we figure out how to coexist with nature, since we're a part of it, we're the only species in nature that can actually choose the way we do. So we have to choose how much we take and how much we give back, and that gets profit into the picture, especially when you're in the business that I'm in. So should my goal be to profit, or should my goal be to fit into nature and enjoy working with nature and making a living from nature, but my goal is not to get as much money as I can get?
I think you just said it perfectly. I mean, isn't that the challenge? To know how much? I mean, you know, it's just how we value things. And I mean, it shouldn't, again, it shouldn't be an either or thing. I come from a family of geologists and miners. And boy, we had a lot of interesting discussions around the table at night. But with logging, there are, as most people know, there's ways to do it that are not, you know, cut and run. And that can work in some areas in the tropics because it grows back quickly. Here it takes hundreds of years to get a forest back. But selective logging and that sort of thing, I think we just gotta not keep looking at it all in terms of dollars and cents, and then see if we can squeeze in a little bit for nature. That's all I can say. I think you should be up here talking. I really do. I admire what you said. Yeah.
Currently, we have about 8 billion people on the planet.
7.9.
By 2055, I hear we're gonna have possibly 10 billion people on the planet. How do we mitigate the sheer number of humans on the planet? Because by
Who are you people asking us to ask? Like I know?
Just a thought.
You can speak into this and tell.
It's a tough one, and I never
Yeah.
hear that particular issue addressed, and I think it's a very important part of
it
this
is.
whole equation that I don't hear anybody talk about. I don't know.
Repeat that question just real quickly and answer it, and then we get it back.
Oh, he's going. No, that's the all-time question is both how many people can this planet support sustainably, and then how can we change our attitudes? I mentioned India a minute ago. There's a hell of a lot of wildlife in India, and there are 1.3 billion people there. But they don't view themselves the same way we do in relation to other creatures. They see it more like our Native Americans. It's a circle of life, of equals. And so I'm saying attitudes can get us a long ways. You can have 100 people living somewhere with 10 times the impact of 100 people with different attitudes and willingness to see what works for them and for nature. But beyond that, you're just asking why no politician wants to bring this up, and the answer is she won't get elected. You know, it's just and what species has ever sat down and said, let's have a meeting and decide when we're going to quit procreating after so many litters. I don't know. We're making it up as we go along, right? Boy, on that's a closer. Thank you.
being our presenter tonight. And where's Tom? Tom, you want to come up, please? Tom Roberts, we're lucky enough, our organization is lucky enough to have a resident artist with us, and he cranks out a lot of work. Just basically give him a call, and all of a sudden he's on whipping out a watercolor or an oil. And so, Tom, I'm going to have you present Doug with this painting. It's a painting of a grizzly for the appreciation for us to have him as our speaker tonight.
Well, whenever you do a grizzly and cubs, which this is, you always say the cubs are so cute. And so I didn't give you the face of the cubs because I didn't want it to be a cute painting.
Show us.
Here, you gotta shut, where's my light? No, I got it in my pocket, here, you hold it up. I'm lighting it.